Welcome back to the Backslider Diaries, the podcast for the faithful, the frustrated, and everyone caught somewhere between a pulpit and a panic attack. I'm Tim.
I'm Jay.
And I'm Lance.
In this episode, we're talking about the Great Divide, how the rise of MAGA and hardline evangelicism didn't just change churches, it tore families apart.
We're glad to have Lance here with us again, offering his unique viewpoints into the evangelical experience. So glad to have you, Lance.
Thank you for having me back. Always good to be here.
And today we want to talk a little bit about the history of the marriage, the evil marriage between evangelical Christianity and politics, and then explore what many of us are probably living with in our day-to-day life, which is how to walk the fine line between maintaining family relationships, maintaining boundaries, and yet not violating our own values or ethics in the process. And that, my friends, is a sticky wicket. Would you guys agree?
Totally, because a lot of the things that we were taught growing up, which are values that I think we all still hold dear, our parents have seemed to turn totally away from that. And like, that doesn't matter. Just on a very, very, minor level, sore loser. I was always taught not to be a sore loser. When you lost the baseball game or you won the baseball game, you went out and you shook hands with everybody afterwards. You were a gracious winner and you were a gracious loser. And that all seemed to go out the window when it seems like if they don't get their way, then rules don't apply, So
Yeah.
that hypocrisy is just one of the things that drove me away and kind of opened my eyes. But I really always thought that my parents believed in those things. And now I see, well, no, they don't. They believe in a means to an end.
Well, 2 points there, and that's a great viewpoint to begin with, because one of the things that I think has been eye-opening to me, there's a deconstructing of faith, and that's its own thing. And then, just with even out the politics, there's how do I, as we discussed last time, how do I come out to my family and say, this is where I am now with these beliefs, and we can believe differently and still have a peaceable relationship. But then when you add into that, it almost feels like betrayal trauma of the political aspect that's come into play, because now it's no longer you and I don't agree on the same things from the Bible. You and I view the world in very different ways, and the ways in which you taught me to view the world and how to treat other people have suddenly gone out the window. And I think that in looking at that, one of the phrases that has kind of become a mantra for me to explain it to myself, if that makes sense, is to remember that truth, which I was always raised, truth is absolute, right? You can't change a single word, precept upon precept, line upon line. But now it seems to be more truth is whatever serves the narrative at the moment. And I think it's important that we address from the beginning of this, there has, at least from my perspective, and you guys can feel differently. For me, living with this, I've realized there has to be an element of compassion and realizing brainwashing is a real thing. Cult think is a real thing. And there has been an overt effort to really persuade and co-opt evangelical beliefs on behalf of political parties. And so a lot of people that are kind of caught up in that don't realize they've been brainwashed. They don't realize that they've been really systemically kind of conditioned to think in ways that probably don't align with who they were even 10 years ago. I think for other people, however, it's kind of given them permission to unleash some of the darker sides of belief that they might not have exposed to themselves or the public in the past. It's like I heard somebody say the other day, "Oh, we're free now to say the R word." And I'm like, "Why would you want to? Why is that a reward? Why does that feel like something good for you to now be able to do? And how long have you been hiding that?" So I think all of those things come into play. What do you think, Lance?
Well, a few things. So I do think the current climate does give people permission to maybe say things that they had previously learned to keep to themselves. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective. Sometimes it's a good thing to have it all out in the open so that people are more genuine in how they're speaking and how they're talking, so that you're not necessarily in relationship with people that you don't know. I am kind of curious about the red line, back to what you were saying about having to agree to disagree. Like what, like I had a conversation with my dad. He felt like I just wasn't going to be in a relationship with them if they didn't agree. And I basically said, no, that's not it. You can believe what you want. It's just when it comes to your behavior and the things that you did that violated my own boundaries, that's where my red line was, because you did things. And I don't think we talked about some of the specifics behind that, but we can go into some of that. But I tried to emphasize that it's not about your belief, it's about how that came out into your actions.
Mm.
That really was my red line.
That's a great point. That's a really great point. Yeah, because, we may all have different beliefs, but acting on those, and for me, part of my red line, my father has been very vocal in trying to advocate, not just hold beliefs that I disagree with, but actively try to use his platform to advocate for those beliefs and to call others to action, to literally have boots on the ground with those beliefs. And, for me, just as an example, my mother and I today were having a disagreement about immigration. And, she was making the point of they need to come here legally. And I'm like, Mom, you realize they're arresting people who are at the courthouse trying to do it legally. Like, how do you make those things kind of can make sense in your brain? And my husband, his grandfather immigrated here from another country and had six beautiful children who all of them are very successful. They're doing well, they're educated, they're members of their community, members of their faith communities. And you look at that history and you're like, where's the negative? It's one thing maybe to hold a belief, but when you're saying and doing things that are actively causing harm, for me, I think that's a red line. Um,
Well, I don't think it's about immigration per se. I think it's about racism. And I think
Absolutely.
the current climate has allowed all these racist, misogynistic assholes to come out of the closet, so to speak, and say what
Mhm.
they want. And I think that's just a kind of a balancing act in life. We went really far one way liberally in our zeitgeist or whatever.
Mhm.
And now it's flipped back to the other side of the spectrum, where, okay, now we're just going to be big assholes. And unfortunately, majority of our country are big, redneck, racist assholes.
Yeah.
Sorry to say,
Uh,
just that's the way it is.
no, it's a good point, and for me, it begs the question, like, if you're just gonna look at it on principle, a lot of that anger, I feel like, comes from the feeling of other people are coming here and taking away our resources, taking away things meant for me. Well, if you hold that up and compare and contrast it with Christian theology in the main, most Christian theology is, "I own the cattle on 1,000 hills," We come from this background that says that God has an unlimited wealth to give to his children, and that, all you have to do is ask and you'll receive and you will be provided for and all this other stuff. So it's hard for me then to reconcile, how are you being so selfish and stingy and saying, well, there's not enough and that's mine, and you're taking my resources from society, when your faith implies that you have kind of this one-way telephone, I guess, to God to ask for your needs to be met. So, my question in looking at this topic spawned the other question of, how did we get here? And I think it's important that we understand a little bit of the history and the ideology, especially in light of current circumstances. And before we go further, I do want to pause and just offer my most sincere condolences to all of those who have endured the loss of the tragic assassination of the Minnesota lawmakers this week, everyone who's been caught in that situation, as well as all of those who have been harmed by the actions of various federal agencies who are just pulling people off the streets and breaking up families. That heartache and trauma is now going to have to be dealt with by so many. So our condolences. But since we're on the topic, talking about the events in Minnesota, one of the things that came out about the shooter who assassinated this government officials in Minnesota this past week.
Allegedly.
Yeah, no. He's on video. Okay, allegedly. Allegedly, sure. He actually is an evangelical Christian. He, by his own writings and social media history and the churches he attended and people that lived with him, etc., this is documented. You can do your own research, as it were. But he was heavily affiliated with the New Apostolic Reformation, which I'll address in a second. He attended Christ for the Nations in Dallas, Texas for several years. He went on several evangelical mission trips to Africa and shared his version of theology there. He was also a heavy follower of Reinhard Bonnke, which I'll never say that right, Smith Wigglesworth, and other kind of miracle-based Christian theology. So let me ask you guys, have you before this heard in the mainstream the phrase New Apostolic Reformation?
No.
I try to avoid all that kind of silly talk.
I know you do. I know you do. Okay. So, just by way of background, the New Apostolic Reformation is an influential Christian movement that's become more and more influential in the past 10 years. And they played a very significant role in the intertwining of the MAGA movement, the Heritage Foundation, and evangelical Christians. If you see the images of the people in the Oval Office with their hands extended and praying for Donald Trump, some of those famous pictures, those are directly influenced by New Apostolic Reformation groups. They're very active politically. It's not, just to be clear, it's not a denomination, but it's a network of charismatic leaders, churches, and ministries. They believe heavily in modern day restoration of the offices of the apostles and prophets. And that would be kind of a parenthesis where your Kat Kerrs come in and your Kim Clements and people sort of that ilk, YouTube prophets and things. They're seen as kind of having special spiritual authority and sort of functioning as the divine mouthpiece of God. So the idea with this modern day apostles and prophets is they think that God has anointed new apostles and prophets to lead the church and take dominion over society. And a part of this thinking, I don't know if you guys have ever heard this term, this was heavy in one of the churches I attended, was the idea of dominion theology or dominionism. Have you guys ever heard of that? Okay.
Only
Lance,
recently. Only
recently.
recently.
You might also hear it referred to as seven mountain dominionism. And the idea is that Christians should take the kingdom by force with regards to the societal institutions of government, media, education, business, and these seven kind of hills of culture, and that they should influence them for the cause of evangelicism, conservatism, and ultimately hasten the return of Christ by preparing the body. They have a heavy emphasis on spiritual warfare, very, very big into the idea of casting out demons, battling satanic forces. They see Hollywood and the media as demonic. They see elements in pop culture as being almost like, you'll hear some things like music is spell casting, secular music is spell casting, and it's trying to infiltrate your spirit and this and that and the third. They're also very, very big into miracles and sort of the supernatural aspect with healings, with prophecies, things like that. You can use your imagination. And this is the big one. The prophets believe they get direct revelation from God themselves about politics and world events. And then they go onto YouTube or they go into their churches and they preach not just, it is no longer the message of Christianity. It is the message of take the kingdom by force, right? That any means justifies the end. And the end is to put Christians of this particular stripe into high level positions. And that's where, just by way of backtracking, if you can go all the way back to Jerry Falwell, right? When the big kind of pivotal moment where republicanism joined with Christianity in public facing things was Ronald Reagan was campaigning for president, and he went to this big Christian coalition meeting with Jerry Falwell. And it was televised, if I'm not mistaken. And at that time, I believe it's the Johnson Doctrine was still in effect that said a religious group cannot endorse a political candidate. So Reagan got up, being the orator that he was, and said, I'm so happy to be here amongst Christians. And let me tell you, I know that you can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you. And that moment right there was really the handshake of, up until that time, evangelical Christians were kind of looked down upon as lower educated, lower class, too demonstrative. Charismaticism was really seen as almost a very fringe sort of element. And that really started bringing it into the mainstream. And so when that happened, politicians began to see, oh my God, there's this huge voting block. They have different socioeconomic backgrounds, they come from different places, even different racial backgrounds, but we can unify them through the funnel of religion and make this voting bloc now strongly identify with us and think that we're advocating on their behalf and therefore win their votes in perpetuity. So, by way of background, that's a little bit of where that comes from. And then just to finish that bit up, how does the New Apostolic Reformation movement work with MAGA specifically? So, and again, I know many of you listening may be aware of this. For those of you who haven't been in church groups or circles or friends or family or been on Facebook in a while, this may be new information, but a lot of people in that world that function under the realm of profit specifically, the way they get around a lot of the ethical issues and the bad behaviors and the kind of things that would normally make one clutch their pearls, so to speak, is because they say that Trump is the modern day Cyrus, the modern day David, right? They use those two people from the Bible to kind of say, well, David, committed adultery and had his lover's husband killed at battle so he could sleep with Bathsheba. God still used him because he was a man after God's own heart. And then, of course, Cyrus, being in the Bible, a biblical figure who was not a believer, but who God used to help deliver Israel. And so, it's really a how can we make this fit our narrative, right? So that's what they use as a counter argument when you say, okay, well, Trump's a convicted 34-time felon. He's been convicted in a civil court of sexual assault, along with many other charges that have come up. There's certainly questionable relationships with certain people we won't mention who lived on an island and had airplanes and allegedly liked younger people. So the way of overlooking that is by saying, well, David wasn't perfect, but God used him because his heart was for Israel. And what they've really done is they've framed politics now as spiritual warfare. Right. So they've used this platform of Seven Mountain Dominionism. They've used this framing of political leadership as the David figure or the Cyrus figure. And they've said, well, clearly there's a war against us because that Christian persecution complex is strong. And this person is standing up to be they are going to level the playing field on our behalf. They're going to make sure that we are no longer persecuted, which, newsflash, they're not persecuted. And they've really framed that as such spiritual warfare that now that's what people see. And that's where you get a lot of the language that you specifically saw in Minnesota.
The Johnson Amendment, I believe is what it's called, is still in effect. Unfortunately, the IRS doesn't enforce it for whatever reason, probably obviously political pressure, because half the reason that Republicans are in office, most of the reason is because of evangelicals,
And donations
unfortunately,
as well.
and
And
donations. And
why don't you clarify
if
what the
churches,
Johnson Amendment is?
it basically says that churches are not allowed to endorse political figures. They can have, like, they could have the Democratic and the Republican and whomever else come speak at their congregation, but they can't just endorse one specific candidate over the other.
And if they do,
Otherwise,
they lose yeah.
their
Go
tax
ahead.
exempt status, which, if it wasn't for tax exempt status, I wonder how many churches there would be.
Right,
And
and,
then
not to
also
mention
I was gonna
mhm,
say that, when you were talking about the whole platform of this new, evangelical movement, it's really ironic that it sounds just like those big scary Muslims. They're
well,
the white version, the Christian version of the same thing that they're terrified of.
and you're exactly spot on with that because a lot of the viewpoints and beliefs that the New Apostolic Reformation purports are things like people who are gay should not be living, women should not have the right to vote. One of the big pushers, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the SAVE Act. which has been being lobbied right now in Congress. That's an act that has to do with voting rights. And in part of that language is embedded that you have to present documentation with your original name as it shows on your birth certificate. And that if you don't, you're not allowed to vote. Well, what does that do to married women? They've changed their name for marriage and they're not going to accept a marriage license as proof of change. And frankly, who has all of their documents of origin, like, filed away and tucked away? My husband had to get his birth certificate for a job verification the other day, and he had to like call his mother. He's 49. And he'd be like, Mom, do you have my birth certificate? So, you're not wrong. A lot of people do call them the Christian Taliban, and that's that part of the mindset. Then back to the Johnson doctrine, you have people who've been violating that for years, right? And who definitely get up in the pulpit, and the way they kind of get around it is, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I'm going to tell you I'm voting with the Bible, and the Bible has me voting for XYZ candidate, right?
They're way over to the top more than that. They'll just flat out come out and tell you who to vote for because God told them, you know?
Well, I mean, some organizations will go as far as create a separate entity so that they can get away. Like I know Focus on the Family does that. They have two separate
Yes.
entities. So I think they create a for-profit organization so
Mhm.
that they can so that
Right, but then they don't make that distinction or differentiation to their audience.
Mhm.
So from their audience perspective, and
And that's
that's
just
kind
being
of,
deceptive. That's just lying. That is another way of lying. You
well,
know?
should we talk about how many pastors and folks that we know of who take advantage of the tax rule that if
Oh,
you live in a
jeez.
parsonage, you don't have to pay property tax on your home? And
Right.
so they put their vehicles in the name of the church, they put their house in the name of the church, they use their tax exempt status number to buy furniture for that. I know people who are living like that right now who have lived that way for at least 50 years, who have not been pastoring a church for at least a good 20, but they still write their house off as a parsonage. So
Well, it'll
again,
come
truth
back to
is what
bite them
serves
in the
the
butt
narrative.
because it'll come back to bite them if they don't have some money saved because they won't be getting Social Security because they never paid into it.
Yeah, Lance,
But
I'm
that's
sure,
socialism.
uh, well, I'm sure in your line of work, you may have run into a lot of that too.
yeah. How did you all view separation of church and state growing up? I'm just curious how that was presented.
Well, I always was taught, I mean, I was a big history buff. I read a lot and I understand that the founding fathers didn't come here so people could worship God. It was not freedom of religion. I feel like it was more freedom from religion.
Yeah.
Freedom to kind of do what you want. And that's another thing about lying preachers. Every time they get in the pulpit and say this church was founded on God, that's bullshit. I mean, read history. That's a lie right there. But no, I was always a little different from my family, and I always felt that separation of church and state was a good thing, just like separation of all three branches of the government is a good thing. It keeps checks and balances, you know. And to force one specific religion on somebody or force somebody to believe something, that's as anti-American as can be.
Yeah, and I
I
guess for me, the takeaway that I kind of got from that, which is interesting to you because we were raised in the same house, presumably by the same people. But my takeaway as a child or a young person from that idea was that we have a separation of church and state, but it shouldn't be. That by having the separation of church, this is what I was getting from my elders, as it were, right? From church leadership, that God's real wish was that America would be a Christian nation and, would pray in school. Like oh my God, I remember my mother going off on a tangent about Madeline Murray O'Hare and her battle against prayer in school. And, I personally, I didn't see it that way. I kind of felt like, well, what if somebody's not a Christian? They shouldn't have to deal with a different religion because I myself wouldn't like I wouldn't want to be preached to in any religion, but let alone one that, had nothing to do with me or my history or whatever. So that's I guess that was my takeaway. And then when I got older, I found out there was two groups in the founding of the United States. The first group was the Puritans that actually came here because they weren't allowed to be as strict as they wanted to be overseas, and so they were kind of like, "No, you can't be that harsh with it," and so they left to be able to kind of really go to extremes. But then our founding fathers, the intellects and thinkers and philosophers, they weren't Christians, they were deists. And, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that had like the divine watchmaker theory of there may be a God, but God set the world in motion and now is hands off. But I think I was probably raised more with the kind of dominionist mindset that only when America returns to its religious roots will there be peace in the Middle East, the red heifer in Israel, the rebuilding of the temple, like, and the return of Christ.
Isn't
Well,
isn't the Antichrist supposed to do that and then all hell breaks loose, right?
Interesting. Go ahead, let's.
I've forgotten. I don't remember. But it's I feel like I live in a topsy-turvy world to some degree because I remember my father preaching a message about the need for separation of church and state and that we enjoy the liberties in our religion, but because of that, we also have to tolerate that there is a church of Satan as well. And he
Mhm.
elevated that idea of religious freedom for me growing up. So to be in this topsy-turvy environment of Christian nationalism where the things are
Mm.
starting to meld together seems in opposition to what I remember being younger. And also growing up in a Christian church school, that was also emphasized. The state shouldn't come in and tell us how we need to be educated within our church, right? Like, again, that was all supportive of separation of church and state, but all of that has shifted back into something else that is unrecognizable to me.
Well, I think
No.
that you have to look at it from the perspective of that was during the Cold War. Everybody was scared of Russia. And so when
Hmm.
you put it in that context of separation of church and state back then, Russia
Yeah.
was the church, Russia was the school, Russia taught your children. And I think they were looking at that sort of a fear of, oh no, separation of
Communism?
church and state because we don't want
Mhm.
the state to tell us what to do. But in this context, like you said, we're in the upside down, and now they have the opportunity to take over the country, and they'll be telling them, they'll be running them, they'll be
Yeah.
telling them what to do. So that's,
But
I think, the difference there.
there lies the beautiful, terrible conundrum, right? And I think for myself, growing up in this world as a woman, this has kind of been the bifurcation that I've seen all along. There were the rules for me, but not for thee, or rules for thee, but not for me, right? And
Do as I say,
always.
not as I do.
Right. And before, there was that idea that the separation of church and state is there so that we don't have anybody infringing upon us and telling our children what to believe in schools and in public spaces and what have you. Now, that has flipped to we should absolutely be able to tell people what to think and believe in public
Mhm.
spaces through legislation, et cetera. And, I have a friend who's a teacher in Texas, and she's really grappling right now because she teaches in a big blue city in Houston, Texas, and they're facing the fact that they're going to have to put the 10 commandments up next year and in a public school. And I asked her, I was like, well, how are you going to approach that? And she's like, well, the rule is it has to be on an 8.5 or 11 by 14, whatever size piece of paper presented in the classroom. So what she's going to do is she's actually going to make a comparative religions board and have it posted up there as one of the many kind of belief systems of different religions. Happens to be a literature teacher. And so she's going to be using it sort of through that lens, which that works for her. But what about in math? You know,
Well, why don't you just post it in the original language?
there
There you
you
go.
go.
I
There
mean,
you go.
it's there, but nobody
Well,
can understand it. And
Well,
they'll
so
probably come in and say, "What's this Muslim stuff you have on the wall?"
right. But so one of the ways that groups like this kind of pigtailed into more mainstream, I guess, belief systems, like hardcore. So at least when I was growing up, Pentecostalism was sort of seen as like the hardcore version of charismatic belief systems and evangelical belief systems. How did this political movement get all of these different groups and denominations who, despite having a similar belief system, had very different ways of approaching how those beliefs looked in life and how they kind of walked in life? And, one thing that's been so interesting is to see that the political groups have really kind of co-opted. They found a few sort of planks that everybody had in common. One of them being abortion, one of them being the Christian persecution complex and the longing for religious freedom, which they think they're persecuted. And again, they are not. The idea of traditional family values, concerns about homosexuality, and most recently, the whole idea of trans people in athletics, which, by the way, if you do the research, that is less than 1% of the people who play um, K through 12 sports. It is such a small number, it's not even an issue. And they've chosen to make that kind of the hobby horse to rile people up, not to mention the underlying racism and misogyny that's been there too. Christian schools, in fact, were begun in the 70s as private institutions, and they would call them, I think it was the 60s or 70s, right when school segregation unfolded and we started having, schools being mixed groups. The Southerners didn't like, they set it up as Christian schools, as parochial schools, so that they could kind of admit who they wanted depending upon their belief agreements and things like that. So all of that racism and misogyny had been really bubbling under the surface and was really part of it. I mean, look at the KKK and the crosses that they burned, right? It was the idea of preserving white womanhood and Christianity and family values. So we never really resolved those issues as a nation. We sort of shoved them under the bed. We made some boundaries with legislation around them, but we never really resolved the heart of that. So when these political things started coming up, and they were like, "Oh, well, even the Baptist and the Pentecostals agree on abortion. Even they agree on the idea of traditional family values. And even they still have these undercurrents, especially in the South, of racism and misogyny. And they folded all those things in together. They got the endorsements of people that already had gained trust in those communities, like Franklin Graham or like Paula White. And then they began to infiltrate and ingrain themselves with Christians and really stoke fear of saying, hey, it's not just that we disagree politically, the Democrats are demons. They want to send your children home from school and make them trans, which if you've ever known anybody going through that process, that's just ridiculous to think that's not how it happens. And, to really prey upon their fears of you're losing your culture, right? You need to defend your heritage. Well, what heritage are you defending? We're supposed to be a melting pot. So what heritage are you defending? And listen to any country music song. God, mama, girls, and hunting, right? That's oversimplification, but that's really what's been played upon. And they've done it strategically and systematically and systemically for 2 or more decades through multiple avenues of media. And then when social media came into play, that really accelerated things.
Was just recently having a memory while you were talking of hearing a whole sermon about why Michael Dukakis was the Antichrist. I mean, I was very young when Michael Dukakis was running, couldn't even vote yet, and already the lines have been drawn for me growing up. Um, and as far as the religious right, I guess the documentary that opened my eyes to some of that was the Jerry Falwell stuff that was displayed in the God Forbid. I had to look it up to remember the name, but God Forbid on Hulu is essentially got a pretty good chunk of the history of the religious right. And of course, as abortion came up, that's always been the polarizing issue. However, I think if you took the abortion issue off the table, the lines would still be drawn in some other way.
Mhm.
And I do think a couple of things, like we said earlier in the discussion, how people are more entitled to share what they truly have maybe thought or believed in terms of racism, in terms of fear, in terms of the other, like all those things that they've maybe learned to hold on to during more liberal administrations, especially the Obama administration, things, the pendulum swung the other way, and people are more free to share racist ideas, racist comments, especially around systematic racism.
Mhm.
So there's just so much. And you did mention about trans. I mean, they are the new uh, enemy that's supposed to be the unifier, to use fear in order to unify a group of people for the purposes of power. And what greater group than a group that is less than 1% of the population? Like, you can't get smaller than that
Mhm.
in order to demonize a group.
That's a great point.
I just and all of this and the underpinning for all of it, I think you asked earlier about how did we get here? It all has to do, in my mind, at least my experience, is superiority complex. Like the signs, the wonders, the speaking in tongues, the healings, all of that was almost sought after, I believe, as almost a spiritual validation of we have the truth, we have the power, other people don't, and it's such a superiority idea because I think there's some insecurity there that everyone needed some sort of powerful validation
Well,
for
if
it.
you that's such a good point. If you look at it, the people historically, going back to the 90s when Pentecostalism really took root in the United States and with Parnham and, Azusa Street and all those different things. These were the people who were very disenfranchised. It was a lot of disenfranchised poor white people in the South. Right. And they didn't have as much access to education. They were on the outskirts of society and were looked at as the lesser than. And you would have the beautiful, nice Baptist church in the middle of the town. And then out there on the edges of town by the juke joints and the honky tonks, there'd be the Pentecostal church with the whooping and the hollering and everything else. And in some places, the snake handling and all of those things. So there was already a pejorative position, right? And I think you're right. I think that might be where some of the roots of the persecution complex come from. And,
And I
you know,
can
you,
hear it like right now in my head when you're saying that, like a preacher going, you've been put down, you've been the bottom of the barrel, you've been looked down upon your whole life, but now you have something that they don't have. I can just hear
exactly.
that. I've
Right. No,
heard it
you're
so
right.
many times.
Yep. And even, as you said, Lance, this is such a great point that it can't be said enough. When you're in that world, you are conditioned to believe that there is a very much a hierarchy of belief, right? And the other denominations they're kind of here. They're entry level. They know Jesus, they read the Bible, they're almost there. But if they don't baptize in Jesus' name, speak in tongues, have healings, have the fruits of the Spirit and the signs and the wonders and the prophets and the this and the that, they have not been given the full power that was intended. And they're not quite there yet. God help me, you mentioned the Catholics, because I was raised that there were Christians and then there were Catholics, and Catholics were not Christians. And I think it's very
Yeah.
interesting in this political framing. The positioning of Amy Coney Barrett onto the Supreme Court was a direct move to bring in that Catholic ideology. If you don't know, she's very much a fundamentalist Catholic and actually has been part of a group that's very similar to it. They actually are called the Handmaids, which that's scary as hell. That's a whole nother story. Go research that and
Well, I
take your
watched the
Xanax.
show. That is very scary. The Handmaid's
No,
Tale. Like,
it's a real group. She's very much part of that group, and that's kind of as well as JD Vance. He's part of what's called Opus Dei. I don't know if you're familiar with that as well, as is Peter Thiel, who is the tech oligarch who funded JD Vance and really put him in position. And Trump had to be told, "This will be your running mate," right? And that's how they folded in the Catholics. They brought them in on these cultural issues where they thought there was alignment with the evangelical Christianities. They brought in the evangelical Catholics and folded those things together to kind of create this lockstep, movement. And to this end, I think this is a good point before we move on, is that you have to recognize once you've been in a cult, once you've had group think and you've kind of suspended your own ability to rationalize and think through things and you've accepted dogma as truth just because the prophet says, right? That's right next door to being able to be brainwashed by other things. Once you've been kind of brainwashed and had your thoughts sculpted in those ways, look how many people come out of evangelicism and go right into another cult, right? Or they're in multi-level marketing scams, or they're in, essential oils or whatever the thing is. And so it's not a big jump if you go from a high control thought group of religion to now you're just expanding that to politics. They're already primed and ready. I don't think that you could have had that same, I guess, success of engagement with a group that wasn't so they've been conditioned, that's the word I'm looking for. They've been conditioned to accept authoritarianism and suspend their own thinking behaviors. Does that make sense?
I might have a lower opinion of human behavior than you do, mainly
I don't know
because,
about that.
well, the reason I say that is because what you described kind of sounds like it's been perpetrated. But I do think there is an element where people's behavior is definitely wanting to self elevate, to belong,
Mm,
to be greater. Like I put a little bit more onus, I guess, on the followers because they are wanting to write a narrative that is supportive to elevate themselves. And
yes.
and so they do follow that even, I think, maybe even without being conditioned, just because we have human behavior. And of course, so the bad word evolution. My husband taught a sermon essentially on the lizard brain, right?
Mhm.
The whole evolution of the need to survive and how we're conditioned to focus on the other. And I think there's a human behavior element that we are just evolved. We haven't evolved, maybe is the better term, to the point to get past that lizard brain.
No, that's such a great point because you're right. Fundamentally, we are tribal animals. You
Hmm.
know, we just are. And you're right, we want to belong, we want to be in the in group. And when you have a group of people who, perhaps by socioeconomics or by virtue of being branded a fringe religion in the past or things like that, or intellectually looked down upon, which the rise of anti intellectualism goes hand in hand here with what we're talking about in the past, especially to be a minister of kind of the more traditional denominations like Baptist or Episcopal or Lutheran or whatever. So you couldn't just stand up and say, I feel called by God, right? You had to go to seminary. You had to receive some level of education and, conference of study or something like that. But in the Pentecostal or evangelical tradition, you can just say, hey, yesterday I was out there riding a backhoe, but today God told me I'm the prophet. So buckle up, you know?
Hmm.
And this provided such an on-ramp into now it's not just that you're being kind of considered and patted on the head. Your representative is the highest elected official on the face of the earth, right?
Hmm.
There are people that believe just like you now on the Supreme Court. Now you can look at Congress and see them praying with their hands raised, which I remember, man, if you ever brought a friend to church and then the congregation started raising their hands in worship, you knew it was going to be one of those moments where you had to explain to your non-church going friend, like, no, they're not asking questions. They just are raising their hands in celebration of worship, right? So yeah, I think that's spot on. It's that on-ramp to being in the in group. You're right.
And I do think politically there is a power play on that to use fear in order to mobilize
Mm.
that. And then I think T, you said earlier about the reaction. And I've always seen it as a pendulum on the political climate coming out of Obama, that things do tend to swing the other way. And I think we saw that.
And because
um,
why though? Because you think it's because of fear
I do
of
think
No, I
losing
think it's
control?
just human nature. Like even in sports, you see it. 4 or 5 years, defense will dominate in the NFL, then it'll swing back to offense. It's just kind of well, in the NFL or in sports, at least in this analogy, the other guy figures out what the other guy's doing, so the other side gets better. But I think in this case, people just get tired of extremes, and so we'll go back the other way eventually, or maybe more to the middle.
mhm.
I thought, oh, we had learned our lesson a few years ago, but we didn't. And now, if you look around, a lot of the people that voted for him, I think, are starting to regret it, especially financially. In Florida, I saw farmers are not even able to pick their tomatoes, and they're having to just till over their crops because they don't have any workers anymore. So, cutting off your nose to spite your face there. A lot of people read the Bible, but they don't read it, I guess.
No, but you're right, because if you look at what happened post 2020, they didn't, as you mentioned at the top of the show, they didn't just accept that with the graciousness of, well, we've lost and we'll represent our platform next time and see what the public says. They came at it from the side of, you have been robbed. You have been disenfranchised. Your voice was silenced. This was stolen from you, and really stirring up what Christianese would call, righteous indignation and making it really sort of a moral moral, this isn't just you expressing your politics now. This is a moral, spiritual warfare. Again, framing it through those eyes. I remember right after the 2020 election, seeing videos of Paula White like having these 24-hour prayer vigils. She was like calling in angels from different continents
Yeah.
to go do spiritual warfare. Or Kat
Mhm.
Kerr, who was trying to, it doesn't matter. A lot of craziness. Y'all should go look that stuff up if you haven't seen
Well,
it.
just speaking of families being split apart, that was the time for me, at least, when I really, although I had seen it in the past, where I really started to see a really dark side of my parents and just the hatred and vitriol, I think I'm saying that right, that that this brought out in them. Just the racism and the homophobia. You think, growing up, at least I think most people do, that your parents are good people on the inside and they would always do the right thing. But that really opened my eyes to the fact that, they maybe really aren't good people. And, you want to feel sorry for them because they were raised in a different era and they were brainwashed their whole life growing up. But that does not prevent you from being just a genuine good person. And
Right.
that just led me to, you know what? I don't want them around my children. I don't want them to have that influence. And I don't want them in my life because every time I bring them into my life, it hurts me.
It
And
Mhm.
hurts. Yeah.
yeah. And so what's the point of that? They birthed me, they fed me, and they sent me off into the world. And I wouldn't want to be friends with that kind of person. And just because somebody's related to me, I don't feel like it's my responsibility to have a relationship if they're not going to be the kind of person I'd want to
Mhm.
be around.
Well, you know what? And I want to come back to that point of protecting your children. But before we do, I just wanted to offer this perspective when we're talking kind of about where we are. My hope, and maybe, maybe this is pie in the sky, but I've heard it purported that this is an extinction burst. And if you're not familiar with that term, an extinction burst is when you have a behavior or kind of a type of mindset or whatever it may be, and its time has come and gone, right? Idea is that before those behaviors are extinguished, they exacerbate, they ramp up because people see that what they're comfortable with is drifting away. And so they kind of try very hard to fan those flames and make it like, no, this is still great. Horses are still great. Paper record keeping is the way to go, right? And so you do, according to social science, you do see a peak in the occurrence of those activities, but it's because those activities are about to die off because, it's their extinction time. So I'm hopeful that maybe some of the hateful attitudes and those lizard brain driven ways of being are in an extinction burst culturally for us. I mean, other countries, you can look at 1933 Germany. I mean, my goodness, they certainly had a massive cultural overhaul and came out the other side of some extensive tragedy with very different ways of approaching things. Maybe that could be the case here, but hopefully we won't have to go through that.
How could the Germans let this happen? How did the Germans let,
And
the
here we
Nazis
are.
happen? And here we are, like history repeating it. But
So
Lance, I
how do
wanted
we
to,
maintain friendships and relationships with
yeah,
that?
I know my experience. I'll have to think a moment to know if I know others. For me, it wasn't about different beliefs. And I don't know if this just is a unique position for the three of us, because for me, my parents having beliefs was not as problematic as when they took action to those beliefs. And in particular, my parents published a book that was anti LGBT
Mm,
components. And so for me, that
oh,
action
wow.
was disrespectful to me, to my husband, to my family, to my marriage. Had they just said, well, this is what I believe or this is what I think, I don't know. I think I could have tolerated that a little better. But when it translated to actual action and media and a message into the world that I believe was not just hurtful to me, but also toxic potentially to other people and hurtful to other people, that's where I had to back away from a relationship with my parents. And because, kind of like you said, my parents did take care of me, they've supported me. And so I had that conversation with them. I said, I don't see how we can go forward socially and being in each other's lives and actually sharing some sort of social connection. But please know you are my parents. I love you. As you get older, if you need medical help, if you need assistance, if you need financial, I will always be there for you. You were certainly there for me. Like I recognize and at least honor that. But in terms of sharing our lives with one another, so I don't see how we can do that right now. And that's kind of where we have stalled in our relationship.
Well, you have
Wow.
to wonder because like, I mean, parents aren't dumb. They, I'm sure, realized when they were doing that book and doing all that that it was going to hurt you. And what is the reason to do that? Why?
Right.
That's what I think I would be feeling is you knew that was going to hurt me. Why the fuck would you do that?
Hmm.
Right.
And that goes back to it just messes with your mind thinking, did they ever really love me? Did they, you know what I mean? Do they even know what love is? That's my perspective. That's my point of view on that anyways. I would be like,
Yeah.
you knew this was gonna there's an example I have, and I don't want to ramble on. My wife told me I ramble too much, but that I remember when I was in second grade, I was told that I was gonna have to leave public school and go to private school. And I was like a stud in my public school. I had a little girlfriend, I was the quarterback of the flag football team. I was the man. And I remember mom told me in the car. I remember exactly where we were. I remember the car we were in. It's one of the few memories that's just burned into my brain. And I was like, I don't want to do this. I've, tried to plead my point. And in my mind, I was thinking, all right, it's my mom. She knows me. She loves me. If I tell her how I really feel, then she won't make me do it. Well, 7, 8 years later, I was still in private school.
Why,
So
why
that
did they want
really,
you to
uh,
switch? What
They
was the
started a
reason?
church school.
they
They
started a
started a
Oh,
church
Sorry,
school.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so the preacher's kid has to go. But that to me is one of the big life-changing moments for me. I went from this happy-go-lucky kid who loved life, loved his friends, to depressed. I got fat.
mm.
Um, I
But
hated
that's
myself. I had no self-confidence. I felt like it broke me, and I realized at a really young age that somebody that says they unconditionally love you can break your heart. And it was one of the
Well,
hardest lessons I ever had to learn at a really young
and
age.
in a similar way, I describe it a bit different with my parents in that I feel like their love is kind of narrow in that they truly believe what they believe. They believe I'm going to hell, those types of things.
Mhm.
And so they are afraid for me. But that is such a narrow level of love that they can't expand that wider to really appreciate the person that I am, to accept who I am. Like that to me, it's just narrow versus wide. And
Well,
I
and
don't
I
know.
think that, I was told this by the professor I mentioned last podcast who taught the Bible as just literature. He said,
Right.
without love, or excuse me, without death, there would be no love. And I think in the evangelical Christian world, you have heaven. So, you don't have that feeling of, like I do, that we're gonna die. When you're gone, you're gone. So you have more of that love for somebody. There's not going to be an after for
Yeah.
me. In my mind, maybe there is, who knows? But there's not streets of gold that I'm going to be meeting my wife and kids and my dogs on later
Right.
in life, and my cats.
Mhm. No,
So I
that's a
think they
good
have
point.
that thought process is a little different. This isn't the end of the road for them.
Um,
So I think without death, why would you love anybody if you think about it?
Well, and
Like,
and
because they're
there's
not going to
such
ever be gone. You can always have an opportunity to be there with them.
that ties into with there's such pressure around the idea of witnessing and like saving other people's soul, kind of that mindset. And we're raised on these stories of the praying mother who never gave up on their wild child, and they'd go into their prayer closet and they just pray and pray and
The
pray.
prodigal
And even
son
though
is,
exactly. But the flip side of that, and this is a common thread, and I know we have our unique experience, but I have read so much. This has hurt me so deeply, just by way of sharing. I have a child that's profoundly disabled. He relies on Medicaid to cover his extensive surgeries and different things that he needs and stuff like that. My husband is second generation American. His family is Mexican. My children are half Mexican. My older children are actually half, or not half, but partially Canadian First Peoples. Like, we have a lot going on in this family. I myself am a female working in STEM. And so it's like everything that they voted for and advocated for directly comes into the face of and hurts every person in my family.
mhm.
And for me, I've read so many stories of people who are kind of in the same boat. And what I keep picking up on is this is betrayal trauma, right? Like you kind of make your peace with your parents as an adult and you say, okay, we have different views, we see things differently, but that love is kind of the uniting tie that binds and feeling like if the rubber meets the road, they love me, they'll be there for me.
Yeah, this
But
is
when
more
you
than
have
just
a
a generational gap thing.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure, and when you have that betrayal, like, that cuts deep, and I think there's a trauma there that we're still kind of, to put it in a metaphor, we're still trying to kind of build the airplane while we're in midair. We're trying to figure this out in the midst of feeling this betrayal and this sense of, "You raised me in this world with very black and white, clear-cut boundaries, and now what I see from you is directly not only betraying me, but you're betraying yourself. You're betraying these values that have already caused wedges between us. And now what I'm seeing is you let go of me for something that you didn't even hold on to. Right? Does that make sense? Like you
Mhm,
let go of your relationship with me based on all these belief systems and ideas, but yet when something shiny when something that is a golden statue came along that offered you more power or more access or, what you felt like was more certainty in your own spaces and for your own ideals, you let go of your beliefs to grab onto that. So, does that make sense? I'm having a hard time articulating
no,
it,
it
but
does. Also, just things that I was taught all growing up, and I left when I was 18 or 19. But when you sit in church 3 nights a week, it gets ingrained into your head. But the signs that I was told were the signs of the Antichrist. Golden statues, things like that. Those are happening, and they're just ignored. So it's not only betrayal of their morals and values, but of things they just told you. And they will gaslight you and tell you,
Mhm.
no, that's not true.
right.
My mom and
Well, and
dad are
and
the
that's such a
masters of
good point
gaslight.
because, one of the things again that we see over and over is people that have been taught to accept gaslighting in church so often find themselves in abusive relationships or narcissistic relationships where you're being gaslit all the time. And it's like I had a therapist tell me this. How do you recognize red flags if that's the only color you've ever seen? And that certainly was true in my life, but I don't think we're alone in the struggle. And I think that, whether even outside the bonds of religion, there are so many people right now who are struggling that weren't even raised religiously, but they were raised ethically or with a set of principles. And now those principles are being violated. And I just wanted to share really quickly as we wrap up. I was speaking honestly with my mother today, and she was sharing with me her viewpoints on immigration, which I won't belabor you all with. But that being said, I told her, and you guys know, as far as my belief, I leave space for what I don't know, and I leave space for the wonder and the mysticism of it all. But whatever it is, it's not what I was raised on. We'll just leave it at that. But I fight fire with fire. And so I knew I could sit there and tell her my talking points and ideas, and it would be, that's just your college talking. You don't know what you're talking about. The devil's got you. And so I quoted this and I said, well, you're going to have to believe what you believe. But as for me, I'm going to stick with the words of the Bible. And that says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner that resides among you must be treated as your native born brother. Love them as yourself, for you were once foreigners in Egypt. And that's from, if you're looking for a reference, anybody out there, that's Leviticus 19 and 33. And that's the part that I have trouble with is if you're using the Bible to justify your beliefs. I was taught line upon line, precept upon precept. You can't change one word. Of course, we all know cherry picking exists, but if we're going to live amongst the cherry pickers, I'm going to use that to prove the other point because the Bible does say that. And it says, as you've done to the least of my little ones. And Jesus says to them, get away from me with your works. I never knew you because when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was in prison, you didn't come visit me. When I was sick, you didn't take care of me. And they said, Lord, when were you these things? And he said, as you've done to the least of my little ones, you've done unto me. There's another section in the Bible that says true religion is doing what you can for the widow and the orphan, taking care of those who have less than you, So that's what I kind of use to combat those when I feel when I feel up to the challenge, and ironically, the answer is always, "Well, I don't know about that."
Really? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So there's no real kind of, like, apologetics from their end for explaining that, but I think that
Hmm.
collectively, we are all in this place of navigating this line of kind of defining boundaries of how do we maintain relationships with people we love? Can we maintain relationships with people we love? How much hurt do we allow in? How much hypocrisy do we allow in? And how do we grieve that betrayal trauma and the lines in the sand that have been drawn that now leave us on one side and our loved ones on the other?
I
And
think it's
I don't have
different for every
answers.
person, because just between the 3 of us, we all approach it a little bit differently, you know? Jay, you occasionally talk to the parents, and I think mainly it's because of health reasons and they're getting old and things like that. Lance, you see your parents, you know, at events because of the kids and things like that. But
Yep.
I had to totally cut off contact. So, and it's what you can deal with too. You know, I'm really good at compartmentalizing things. That's what I was taught to do growing up. So that's what I do. But then I'll cry while I'm watching a 30 for 30 on ESPN or a commercial about something stupid. And my kids look at me and the tears are streaming down my face and I don't know why. So, but it's nice to have some place to talk about it and know that, you know, you're not alone. Fortunately, the current political climate has brought out the bad in a lot of people. And maybe it's good now that we see them for who they actually are. But it's
Well,
disappointing.
it is, and, I will continue to think to myself, "Man, if Anne Frank and everything that she went through could have written the words that she did," which is, I still and I'm paraphrasing, forgive me for getting the quotation wrong, but she made the statement, "I still believe there is good. I still believe there is love. I still believe that there's goodness in people." I take great comfort in looking at the communities that are developing and the networks that are developing among those of us who resist this kind of hatred and stand together, and I see that emerging. And my hope is that I hope that people can change. I hope that eyes can be opened. I hope that people can begin to see that they've been deceived. And, that takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of strength and courage to stand up and say, I've been wrong. I've been deceived, or I have allowed myself to see things this way because they benefited me. And I try to hold space for that, and I think to some degree, many of us that are facing this situation right now are there. We're trying to hold space, but ultimately, you have to protect your mental health. You have to protect your, of course, physical safety. And hopefully, we'll come through this on the other side. And thank goodness we have, the concept of chosen family. And I would just encourage all of us and our listeners as well. Try to take care of yourself. Strengthen the bonds you have with your chosen family. Strengthen the bonds you have with people that may disagree with you, but they're mentally safe for you. They also hold space for you. Right? And what comes after that, I guess we'll have to find out.
The only thing I would just kind of want to add, uh, in terms of making decisions for ourselves about where to invest our time, our relationships, I did have to come to a reality to understand that some people that are kind of on the line, I feel like I can invest time more with those relationships because there's just more connection, more potential for positive change. And then there are those that are so far right beyond the line that I have shared my own experience. And if my own struggle, my own message wasn't enough to make them consider that maybe the systematic belief system that we grew up in shouldn't be questioned, then I could invest my entire life and not budge anything, right? So I
Right.
just I just had to be realistic about the group of people that I could feel the most benefit, especially as an agent of change, wanting to make positive change for the better for our society, for our relationships, for those that are minority, those that are less than in our system of life.
Mm.
I had to really understand that that's the group of people that is most valuable for me to connect with and share and invest.
Well said, and to quote, as you call it, which I think is so wise, the books of wisdom. One of the things I carry with me is don't cast your pearls before swine, and not to call names,
Mm,
and by no means, cast illusions on people or and be derogatory. But you're right. To some extent, you have to look at your return on investment, so to speak. And if
yeah.
something is going to be of great cost to your mental health or your physical health, and very little is going to be gained from that, don't engage. It's okay to walk away. It's okay to recognize when when something is at the moment at least beyond the point of repair and to lovingly embrace and walk away. And even if that's something you do by yourself and for our listeners, like if that's something that you're struggling with, I would just encourage you. Therapy is always a useful thing. And if that's not in a place that's convenient for you, write a letter, really, truly, like write a letter to people that you're having these disputes with and pour your heart out and then burn that letter, bury it, tear it up, do something, but don't hold that angst within yourself. Let it flow and go. Let it pass through you. See it for what it is. Love where you can, and it's okay to walk away when you need to. Well, peace and love to all of you out there struggling. We know it's not easy, and just know you're not alone.
Yep. We'll see you next time. Later.
Bye.
All right.